Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we wade through the political puddles so you don't have to. Today we're looking at a huge ideological shift happening in America, and it starts with a really surprising story from the heart of capitalism itself. A story that kind of feels like it would have been impossible just a decade ago. Okay, so get this. In New York City, the literal capital of capitalism, a recent leading mayoral candidate was being seriously labeled a communist. And this wasn't some fringe figure. No, they were polling at almost 50%. You know, it's a label that's meant to be shocking, especially in a city built on the idea of the free market.
So you have to ask, how is this even possible? Well, this isn't just about one election. It's a huge signal of a much bigger trend. It really points to a deep disillusionment with the way things are, especially for younger Americans who feel like the system just isn't working for them anymore.
So how in the world did we get here? To really get this, we have to look at the why. What is it about our current version of capitalism that has so many people feeling left out and looking for a totally different answer?
In this feeling, it's not just a hunch. The numbers are pretty stark. A staggering 62% of Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 now have a favorable view of socialism. Let that sink in. That's not some fringe movement. That's a solid majority of an entire generation questioning the very system they grew up in.
The analysis we're looking at points to one huge event, the 2008 financial crisis. You see, for millennials and Gen Z, this was their big introduction to how the economy works. And it wasn't a story about opportunity. It was a story about collapse, about huge bailouts for the banks, and it left this lingering feeling that the whole game was rigged from the start.
But the argument goes even deeper. It suggests that capitalism itself has changed. It's morphed into something new. We went from phase one, industrial capitalism, where we actually built things, to phase two, a kind of hollowed-out financial version all about services and moving money around. And now we're heading into phase three, an AI-driven capitalism that the source calls nihilistic, which sounds a little terrifying, suggesting a future where humans just aren't as necessary.
And this really gets to the heart of the generational split. The capitalism that young people are rejecting today isn't the same one that their grandparents knew. It shifted from an economy of making stuff to an economy of, finance and services. It feels more like a bubble, one that's both out of reach and could pop at any second.
And according to the source, the results of this new capitalism are all around us. You've got a massive wealth gap, giant tech and finance companies with monopoly power, and a real lack of stable, meaningful jobs. Plus, there's this constant fear in the background that AI is coming to replace us all. It paints a pretty bleak picture of the future.
So, with the current system feeling so shaky, it's really no surprise that people are looking for something else. And for a lot of them, that something else is socialism. But what does that word even mean to the generation that's suddenly embracing it?
For a lot of its new fans, socialism isn't about dusty old textbooks. It's an ideal. It's this vision of a society that's just fairer, more equal, one with a strong social safety net that's actually there when you need it. In a world that feels so unstable, that promise of security is incredibly appealing. But here's the big counterpoint in the analysis. It argues that this new generation might be falling for the idea of socialism, without really grappling with the messy, complicated reality of what's happened when these ideas were put into practice throughout history.
And the analysis gives a pretty blunt history lesson. It points to countries where full-on socialist experiments were tried, like the Soviet Union or pre-reform China, and argues they didn't lead to equality and prosperity, but to widespread poverty. It even points to periods of serious economic stagnation in places like the UK and France as a warning for what happens when socialist policies go too far.
This all leads to a fundamental economic argument from the source, which is that government is great at redistributing wealth, slicing up the pie, but it can't actually create it. The theory is that by increasing taxes and government control, socialism ends up shrinking the pie for everyone.
So, this brings us to the core problem, right? If modern capitalism feels broken, but the main alternative has a history of failure, where does that leave us? It feels like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. So here's the central conflict laid bare. On one side, you have modern capitalism, which creates massive inequality and instability. On the other, you have socialism, an ideology that, according to this analysis, has historically led to widespread poverty and stagnation. It's a pretty tough choice. The conclusion here is pretty clear. Jumping from one broken system to another one that's failed in the past isn't the answer. The goal shouldn't be to tear everything down. Instead, the real challenge is to look inward and finally fix the deep structural problems we have in our own economy. So the path forward, as laid out here, is about reform, not revolution. Step 1. You have to admit there are real problems, like monopolies and massive inequality. Step 2. Learn from history and reject solutions that have failed before. And finally, step 3, focus all our energy on building a market system that is just more fair, more competitive, and more humane for everyone.
And that leaves us with this huge, final question. If one system creates extreme inequality and the other one often creates poverty, what does a better future actually look like? Maybe the answer requires us to think beyond these tired old labels of capitalism and socialism. A huge thank you to our producer FireflyHaku for keeping this ship afloat. If you enjoyed this, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and join us for the next deep dive.